Good evening, everyone, and welcome back for Fuse Games Conference, a completely online and free conference from Staffordshire University's Games Department. Our next guest tonight is a mid-level material artist at Frontier Developments and winner of Adobe's Meet Mat 2 competition. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Niki Marinov. Welcome, Niki.
Hello, everybody. First off, I want to thank Europe and everyone involved for having me. I think these kind of talks are very important. They give a lot of insights to students, and however I can be of help to anybody is something I'm really passionate about. So thank you for that. And
We really appreciate your time, Niki, and I'll bring in my co-host who's also really looking forward to this talk today. So it's Mike Acosta, the course leader for Games Art at Staffordshire University, also runs the Materials and Textures module. So both of us really excited to have you this evening.
Thank you. So I've prepared a very small presentation. Well, maybe not that small, but it's in 3 different modules. I'll talk a bit about myself in the beginning, and after that we can go through some Substance Painter and Substance Designer tips and tricks. I've also prepared some Substance Designer files so I can show you some tips and tricks. I won't go too deep into material creation, but I would try to kind of show you some good practices that you should follow, because those are often missed in a lot of tutorials. So they give you the big tutorial and you do the big graph and the whole thing is there. But when you try to do something on your own, you're kind of missing something. And the stuff that's missing is some really small but important bits, in my opinion. So I've been with Frontier Developments for the last 3.5 years, and I've worked on 3 separate games now. So Jurassic World Evolution 2, Formula 1 Manager 2022, and Warhammer Age of Sigmar Rails of Rome. All of these games are very different, and they were presented various different challenges. And I think one of the more interesting things as a material artist is to kind of figure out how to approach a different style and then how to approach the technical aspect, because as a material artist, you're not only an artist, but you're a technical artist to a point. And that very much depends on the engine you're using and the type of game you're doing, because, for example, these 3D games are pretty different. 2 of them are on a proprietary engine, Cobra, and Formula 1 Manager was in Unreal, so it's completely different ways of approaching a game. And one is a management game, one is an RPG, and one is a racing simulator game. But because of the nature of the game, you kind of are making a racing game, even though you're not racing the game. So it's all kinds of different things that can happen in there. And I'm currently working on another unannounced project, Frontier, and another pretty cool project that unfortunately I'm not allowed to talk about at this point. Moving forward, my education is a bit more non-traditional, and I think that is a interesting thing to share, because there isn't a cookie cutter way of making it into the industry. Everyone's path is different, and there isn't a single wrong one. Everyone has their own way of achieving a certain thing, and I want to share that even if you don't do it the way everybody is doing it, that's completely fine. My education is in computer engineering in the University of Russia in my hometown in Bulgaria. And I finished my studies in the University of Coimbra in Portugal, where I spent a couple of months writing my thesis paper, which I then later released as a standalone learning material. So it's like an 88-page free PDF file, which is there for students to learn all the basics, just if somebody's missed it. And that's basically from my own experience, how I've taught myself game art and how I've made this whole thesis paper out of it. And I think sharing information like this is quite crucial, and I'm pretty happy that a lot of students are pretty interested in this one. I've had more than 10,000 downloads of this one, which is a pretty huge number of students actually having read. So it's quite humbling and satisfying that I'm able to help in that kind of way. My career, I worked in a few indie studios when I was a student because every studio wants you to have experience right out of uni, which is unfair, but that's how it is. So I took upon a few different small indie studios where we did some VR applications for real estate. And even though it's not game development, it's still real time, it's still Unreal, it's still the apps that you're using, it's still texture shaders. So it doesn't matter if it's games, it matters that you're actually working on your skills and your portfolio. I then spent some time working for Kitbash 3D as a texture artist. And for the last 3.5 years, I've been in frontier developments, as I've mentioned before. So this is some of the work I've done for Kitbash. So some texturing, remaking textures, pretty standard stuff. It was still early in my career, so it's an example of what we did there. And here's some example of what I did for Jurassic World Evolution 2 at Frontier. So we did a lot of materials that have a lot of height layering, and height layering is something super important, which we will touch later in an example that I've prepared. And I think that's very important to get right, because if you don't lay your materials right, they're not going to have depth to them. And when you're only having a normal map, or if you're only having parallax occlusion, you need to have a lot of depth. And the only way you can achieve that is by learning how to layer things correctly and how your maps can be pushed to the limits of PBR, but not leaving those limits. Here's some more tileable materials from Jurassic World Evolution 2. It had a lot of wood materials, different kinds of them. It was important to keep the style, keep the textile density, and obviously having a lot of similar materials means that you have to have a lot of variation between them, so they're not the same material but slightly different, because that's just a waste of memory at this point. Here's some of the materials I did for F1 Manager 2022, and that was quite interesting because it was a lot more technical. We did a lot of shaders, we did a lot of masks, we did a lot of different clever things. And here I had the opportunity to texture all the different F1 liveries, and we had to talk to each of the F1 teams individually, get the color right, but we couldn't actually get the color from them because most of the color is trademarked. So it was kind of, you have to guess, and they have to tell you if it's right or not, which was incredibly frustrating with some of the teams, which I don't want to mention, but it was a lot of fun and work and a lot of meetings with those teams. Just so we can get everything running. We had a lot of masks that we did in Painter, and those masks then drive some shaders and some other fancy clever effects inside of Unreal, and the cars really do look spectacular, which is something I'm really proud of. We spent a lot of time working on them. We kind of took a different approach where we wanted to have very sharp looking textures, but that doesn't really work if you're only using let's say 1K, 2K textures, even 4K, which we weren't using, but we kind of decided to go with a more high poly approach where the cars have more polygons, but we also have some decals that are also models and not textures, which will allow you to have a hard edge around some of those and not have texture compression, which is kind of gonna MIP not that good with from a distance. And because it's a racing simulator, you're constantly changing which camera is pointed at the cars, which means that they're constantly streaming the textures back and forth for each camera, which doesn't look exactly good if you do everything in one single texture. So we have separated stuff into models and into different textures and different shaders. different shader effects. So it was quite complicated, but the end result is pretty good. One of the other interesting things we did is we had 2 months to do all the curves, which was something phenomenally fast to do. At the end, I think I had 60 different trim sheets like these ones, and in total, I think it was like 220 curves. And people don't really notice that there are that many different curves, but each turn on each circuit is a different kind of curve. It might be similar, but it's going to be slightly different. So I made a system where all of these are using the same kind of surfacing, roughness maps, details, concrete, paint, whatever is similar, we can kind of reuse it. So we managed to create 220 different curves with 60 different trim sheets in around 2 months, which was a lot. But when you're working with Designer in a non-destructible way of making textures, you can really speed up the workflow in the end. And I'll show you some more clever stuff with it a little later on, especially for the tires. One of the really cool things we did for the tires. So we have the 3 different types of tires and the melted version. So we made a shader which melts the tire based on time and based on different various gameplay conditions. So we're driving 2 different textures blended with 2 different masks. And those masks are basically their opacity, and their position is driven by gameplay elements. So the more you drive, the more your tires degrade in game, the more they're gonna be melting. And I do have this example in my art station, which I'm gonna open and show after the presentation. But it's some really clever, really small details that we managed to do as material artists on this project that I'm quite proud of, and I think everyone who really enjoys textures and materials gonna find pretty cool. Again, the Ruin was probably the most fun project we did Frontier. So obviously Warhammer is a big title, and the fantasy stuff is very, very cool. But we managed to have a lot of different varied materials, a lot of materials that are not based on real things, so more kind of alien type materials, let's say, because it's on a different kind of planet. And foliage, for example, wasn't really actual foliage. And we managed to have to take different ownership of different factions and different levels. The thing you see here is the ruins level, which I had the opportunity to take ownership of and texture almost everything you see in here, which was involving a lot of trim sheets and a lot of tile bolts. And trim sheets is something I would like to talk a bit more further on, because I've been asked a lot about them lately, because it doesn't seem to have a consistent tutorials and consistent way of doing those. And the way I do it is usually when the art team makes some walkouts, and with the actual scale, I go in Maya and UV those walkouts. I then bring out the walkouts in Designer with the correct UVs. So I've laid all the UVs into strips, and then I start layering everything into those UVs. So I've kind of create my create my trim sheet based on the UVs I've already created inside of Maya. And I try to put bevels on all the edges, and I'll show you how I do the bevels a little bit later on, just because we want to have this feel that they're sculpted and baked, but obviously it's not going to be like that, and that saves a lot of time, and it looks very good. And I really want to show how I make those. And here are some examples of tile bolts I've been doing for that kit, and some of the other materials, some of the trim sheets. Everything here is 100% been done in System Designer, except for the skulls, which are a baked object. You don't really want to do absolutely everything inside of Designer, because sometimes there is an easier way. For example, I can just grab one of the high poly scroll meshes and just take it down and make some variations instead of making that from nodes, which is going to take a lot of production time. But for everything else, I can do it pretty fast, pretty consistent. So you can see how all the different trim sheets for the different kind of functions look and feel. And I'll try to show a bit more of that later on in my designer presentation. And one of the other really cool things that happened recently to me was I won third place in the Substance Design and Insanity Awards with one of my recent videos, for which I also want to talk about because I've combined multiple workflows into it with some procedural generators in Houdini and some custom procedural filters in Painter, and then combining everything inside of Certain Designer. And I'll show you how I do that. Sometimes it's not really worth it to do everything in Designer, and the results can be much better if you kind of try different approaches. So I think that's something that might be interesting to anyone who wants to learn more about materials. What makes a good portfolio? That's something I've been asked quite a lot. I try to review portfolios as much as I can. Also, for anyone watching, just shoot me a message. I love doing this because I've been asking for portfolio reviews when I was trying to get into the industry, and I think that's the best way to get your portfolio better, because when you're doing something, you don't see your own flaws, the things that you're kind of missing. And when somebody points it out, it almost seems like it's super obvious and it's in front of you. But if you don't see it, you don't know how to fix it. So I think that's something very important. It's very important to have quality over quantity. Have like 5 or 6 pieces, but let them be really, really good instead of having like 20, 30 different unfinished pieces in your ArtStation profile. Just have the best ones and don't be afraid to remove old ones, because your portfolio is only as good as the weakest piece in it. So I'm constantly removing stuff from my portfolio because I'm getting better and I feel like the old stuff is not that good anymore. So don't get too attached to your portfolio is what I'm trying to say. Try to show the best of it. It's very good to have good art direction, because when you're making a portfolio piece, you're kind of you're your own art director, so you have to follow a style. You have to follow the technical specifications. So if that's like textile density, for example, is very important, and you have to set it in the beginning of the project. So you have to follow that. You have to follow the style, and everything has to be consistent. I think consistency is something that a lot of people are missing. And excuse me. For example, I see a lot of projects where people bring a lot of mega scans or just scans into the project, and then they try to add a bunch of stuff done in Painter and Designer. And if your skills aren't good enough to be on the level of a photo scan, you're clearly going to have 2 different separate styles, and that's very noticeable. So to mitigate that, either use only mega scans or try to limit the amount of mega scans you use, just so everything is consistent. So also, it's very important to have relevant projects. So for example, if you want to go to a certain studio, try to have it in the style of that studio. So if you're, let's say, making only hyper-realistic projects and environments and stuff, your portfolio is not going to be really what, for example, Pixar is looking for, because it's very different. So they're clearly going to maybe prefer someone with less experience, but a portfolio closer to yours, because that's what they're looking for. In the end, studios are just looking for people to do the job that they're doing. So you have to match what they're looking for.
Niki, there's a question that's just popped up in the comments. I think it's quite an opportune point to mention it. Is from George. What kind of materials would you recommend to have on a portfolio to best showcase ability? Examples they've said of bricks, muddy ground, sci-fi, etc. What would you prescribe?
So the three examples is three types of materials that I would avoid, to be honest. I think brick textures are a portfolio killer, in my opinion, and I've heard other people say it. And it's because they're super easy to do. Like there's a brick node in Designer, and there's like a tile sampler that you can do a brick shape and do it. And because they're very, very simple to do, a lot of different people will expect different things from a material that's supposed to be simple. So one studio might think that this material looks very good, and another studio might fit with that. So I think that's a material that I would definitely avoid. But feel free to do any kind of other like big stone bricks or anything similar to that. But just the classical brick is something I would avoid. The muddy ground is really good, but it's a texture that is a bit more difficult to achieve for it to be looking good. So it often just ends up looking like a bunch of differently layered noises inside of Designer, and it just becomes really, really noisy to look at. And you can kind of see that it's supposed to be mud, but it's very, very easy to get wrong. So I think that's something to note. And sci-fi is really good, but it's almost everybody's doing sci-fi. So I would maybe try to kind of practice with any other hard surface material. So let's say something industrial, like a wall with some pipes or some panels for example. But I think sci-fi is a bit overdone at this point. So that's one of my ideas. I think trying to make more difficult materials to kind of showcase different approaches. So let's say you're trying to do a material that's really layered, or it has like 5 or 6 different surfaces inside of the same material. So it has, for example, wood, stone, moss, strass, stuff like that in the same material. Shows that you can layer it, but also shows that you can do all those different types of materials at the same time. And I think that's what's important to show. And I think it's important to kind of trying to distinguish yourself from the others by making something that's a bit different. So I often try to make materials that are not that traditional, I would say. So I sell my suitcase material, or I did a Doom inspired material, or one of the camera lenses materials. It shows the different techniques, but in a material that's really not that traditional, I would say. So maybe try to see some images on Pinterest that don't really look like a single surface or single material, and try to replicate that. And one really good thing to do is try to replicate the mega scans. So I've done that with one of my wood flooring materials. So I got a mega scans texture, and I started recreating it. So mega scans, they don't really have that good of a roughness map or a normal map, but they do have spot on color because it's based on pictures. So I take 2 spheres, and the one sphere has the Megascan material, and the other one will have the material I'm making. So I'm trying to match it as close as possible inside of Designer, and studying the color and studying how everything works in there. So I think trying to recreate a scan and make it look like a scan is a very, very good challenge for anyone who wants to get into materials. So to continue what I was talking about, the portfolios, it's good to show some breakdowns of how you did some stuff. It often helps other people how to do the things, and it shows studios that how you can achieve a certain effect. And also it can also help you when, for example, if you start looking how to make a material, let's say if you start looking at how to make a bark material, just search bark on ArtStation or on 80 level, and probably somebody has a breakdown of how they done it. Either those small GIFs or an article on how they do it. So try to learn from that. The best way of learning is looking at other people's graphs. So I think that's something very important. And it gets even easier when you get to a studio and you can learn from all your colleagues. And I've learned so much more stuff since I joined Frontier than ever before. So I think that's super important. And obviously understanding of PBR, how textures work, what's a good texture, and understanding color spaces, which is a very complicated thing, but I would like to go over it just so you can have a understanding of what I'm trying to explain here. And the variety of materials like organics, hard surface, landscapes, and trims. Landscapes and trims, I think, are the most important things you can put in your portfolio, because almost every game you're going to work on, it's going to have landscapes, and those landscapes are going to have to blend based on height maps. So having those shown in your portfolio is very good. And also landscapes often have a lot of layering. So if you take like a forest ground, you're going to have mud, roots, leaves, sticks, and all kinds of other debris around. So that shows a variety of things you can do in Designer, and a variety of layering to your height. And the trim sheet is also very important because it's extensively used. I think I got used to trim sheets so much from the ones on F1 that now anytime they need a big asset, a big library of trim sheets, they give it to me to do at Frontier. So I've kind of been doing those almost every week. So yeah, those are important. So try to do most of those. And here I've kind of went down the rabbit hole of color spaces. So I want to kind of explain a little bit in a more simplistic way sRGB space and linear space. And the funny thing about this thing is when I was making this graph and I was researching more things that I can speak about the color spaces, I got even more confused myself because it's very complicated. And I went into this rabbit hole reading for like a couple of days, and then I had my leads explain to me a bunch of stuff for like 5 or 6 hours. And now I think I have a better understanding, so I can give you a more correct information about color spaces. So for most of you, it's not really important to know the difference. It's a more technical thing that the material artists and technical artists and programmers are doing. But it's important because that's gonna show you if your materials are PBR or not. So an sRGB is the values between 0 and 1, so between black and white, or between 0 and 255, depending on how you want to look at it. And the mid-gray point, so exactly in the middle between the black and white, is gonna be 0.5, or exactly in the middle, like shown on the graph here. When you're working with linear color, all of the blacks are crushed in to the left, and the mid-gray point is something around 0.23, which is not exactly in the middle, but that makes it a lot more easier to kind of understand how shaders work, because shaders just basically are multiplications, subtractions, divisions, and so on, different math operations between vectors and colors. And when you want to make those maths with colors, you want to work with linear, because a 0.23, so 0.23 plus 0.23 in linear space is going to be 0.46. But 0.5 plus 0.5 in sRGB is going to be 0.73. So it's not very good for calculating results. So sRGB is how it's displayed on your monitor and how you want to look at it in game. But when you want to do complex calculations, you want your colors to be in linear space. And the only difference between the linear and sRGB is a gamma correction, so a curve, which is a 2.2, the power of 2.2 of the curve of the linear curve, which is 0 to 1, which is going to give you a more even kind of image. And we want that kind of image because it looks more pleasing to us. But when you wanna do anything with any kind of images, you're gonna have to work with linear. Even one really good example is working with cameras. So with any camera, your raw output before it applies any curves is in linear, because cameras are really good at the darker ends, so the shadows. But if you clip into the highlights, that information is very easily lost. So I think that's a good example of how color spaces will help us and how they work. So here I've done a simple tool in Designer, which I poked into Painter, which shows us the sRGB values. So when you're starting on a project, often there's going to be an established sRGB range for acceptable values. And if they're not, the art director is going to make something similar to this one, and they're going to say everything between these values, for example, here, everything between 50 sRGB and 230 sRGB is a good value. So everything in that is PBR, and it's going to work in the engine and it's not going to break. But anything anything underneath 30 sRGB is going to be too dark, and then everything above 230 is going to be too bright. So I think a sheet of paper is going to be around 228, and anything above, it's just not going to look correct. It's going to blow out, especially when you have post-process effects in games like boom and stuff like that. It's going to easily blow out. Even at 210, it starts blowing out.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Niki. Yesterday we had Filippo Romani, lighting artist, on, and literally talking about similar things but in a different context. And it's just so interesting how you take somebody that's working with materials and then take somebody that's working with lighting, and just bringing up a concept of actually what are acceptable tonal ranges for physical based rendering and physical based lighting. It's just showing that people that went to that talk and this talk, how important it is to get it right.
Yeah, it is. And I'm going to circle back to what I was talking about Formula One Manager. So when people were trying to make all the tracks, they were trying to kind of make them really dark, like very dark albedo, because like the asphalt is usually quite dark. But when you're taking that in midday, it's not really that dark. So if you take a sheet of paper and you light a torch onto it, if you take a sheet of paper that's dark and you light a sheet of paper on it, it's no longer dark, it's no longer black. So the color changes based on the lighting that's actually thrown at it. So that's quite important. And when we work with some of the Formula One teams, they sent us a bunch of images from some of the cars when they were on track, when they were in the garage, when they were in like bright sun or sunset or at night, and they showed us different hex values from those. And I had to kind of explain that color doesn't really work like that, and paint doesn't really look like that. The color is going to change based on any lighting you throw at it. And the other thing is every camera is completely different, and every monitor is completely different, and every sensor captures light in different ways, so it's not going to capture the color correctly. And when you're working with clients that expect a perfect color, that's a very bad way of approaching getting the right color.
How do you even begin to get the right color then? Because you mentioned about the F1 manager, and the difficulties that you had there. Where do you even begin? I mean, that's not just a simple case of color dropping or anything like that. It's got to be some exploration happening.
Yeah, it is a lot of exploration, and it is kind of trying to get a similar idea of how different colors react. So one of the things I did for one of the cars was I tracked down one photographer who was taking pictures on one of the F1 races, and I tracked down which camera he was using. So I wanted to see how the sensor was kind of processing the color, and try to replicate it with my own camera because I had the same brand of camera. Uh, and then after that, I tried to see how that color was shifting in that time of day. So that was one way I tried to approach it, because they didn't give us exact colors. So that was a way of me trying to do the guesswork. And for the most part, that was correct for that car. But for the cars, we had to try different approaches, because with every team it was a bit different. I obviously can get into specifics, but uh, you have to kind of try to get the as close as possible to the color that was generated by the sensor of that specific camera, because absolutely every camera is gonna generate a different color. And don't get me started on phones, because it's even worse there.
Niki, did you get any of the colors right first time?
I did for like 5 or 6 ones, but
Nice.
maybe they weren't right. But like those teams weren't that picky, maybe. And there was one specific team that was, we had to do 11 revisions, and it was kind of a their mentality is like, we can throw more money at it, and like we don't really have time. We have other things to finish in that game. It's not only about that, but some of the teams weren't as picky, and some of the colors aren't really that hard. But the ones that have like a special coating on top, they're quite more difficult to achieve. And
So at least we can limit it down to a couple then.
yeah.
It's Aston Martin, isn't it? It's got to be.
No, Aston Martin was pretty easy, to be honest.
Well, it limited it down with, well, we got one off the checklist there, Mark. So
Yeah. Yeah, obviously, can't tell which one it is, but yeah, my colleagues who know how difficult that was. But yeah, to get back to the graphs here, it's very important to keep in those ranges. When you're making any kind of material that it's in the acceptable ranges, it really doesn't matter what the color is. It's still gonna, even if it's not right, it's gonna be correct, if that makes sense. So I don't really mind having a color that's not right, but if it's correct, which means that it's still going to be somewhat consistent with everything else. But the moment you get out of those values, it's stuff kind of gets a bit more nasty, I would say. But there are exceptions, but those exceptions really need to be like a centerpiece in the game to actually allow that to happen. And that brings us to our next graph here, which is the same thing but for the metallic values. And this is a very controversial topic, because some people purists and say that your values have to be either 0 or 1, and some people are not. I'm part of the purist group, and that's what we do in Frontier. So your metallic map should be either completely white or completely black, and the only acceptable wiggle room you would have would be a transition. So if you're making a metal and it's kind of starting to rust, between the rust and the metal, you would have a transition value, and that value can be different than 0 and 1. And everything in between is nonsense, which would not work correctly. And there are special use cases. For example, silk or velvet. There, if you don't want to use fancy shaders that are super expensive, those are materials that you can put at 0.5 in the grayscale, and that's going to give you a semi-accurate representation of that surface in the engine.
Isn't the argument always, what about the paint that has like metal flake in it? Like, obviously, if you zoomed in enough, then you would have like the white and black next to each other with the metallic flakes and the none. But then if you zoom out enough, they get blurred and end up being grey to some extent. Have you heard that?
Yeah, that's one thing. But you can people really try to get the metallic, let's say, everything completely white, and then get the roughness really down. But if you don't have that, if that metallic value isn't completely, so if that roughness value isn't that dark and it's more white, that would mean that the surface itself is not gonna look wrong when it's either completely white or completely black. But yeah, and it's also very dependent on how your game is gonna look. So, for example, for most of our games, when you're looking at from like a management type of camera on RPG, you want that to be looking good from a distance. Not a lot of people are gonna zoom in and start looking at textures. So you want that to be consistent across everything. And what we also do is kind of exaggerate the details. So if something, let's say, it's supposed to be like 10 centimeters, we can kind of exaggerate it to like maybe half a meter even, because you're looking at it from so far away and you want that to kind of stand out. So for the metallic values, I think it's important to get those right. Otherwise, it's not going to look that right. And the way to kind of mitigate that effect is to if you have something that's full metallic, you try to balance that with the roughness instead of balancing with the metallic. Because I see a lot of people doing stuff like that, especially like in Painter. A lot of people put metallic in glass, which doesn't really work that well when you put it in engine, but it works well in Painter. But people forget that Painter's viewport and render engine is not a game engine, so it's completely different things. And here I have I've made these little graphs into a tool that I imported in Painter. And here I have an example of a prop that my partner did, which I applied those tools. So I made a color checker and a metal validator tool with the same values that we've kind of discussed until now. And here you can see everything that's not right with the prop. So, for example, everything that's red here is too dark, so it has to go a little bit nudge to the right of that graph. And for the metallic values, you can see how here it's not 0 or 1, so you have some of those red values. It's good until you have the yellowish ones, but when you go to the red ones, it means that it's not gonna look that correct. In this example, it's not that bad, but it's a way to show you how we can make a tool and then get that tool in Painter, and we make tools so artists can use them and check their work. So that's part of the material team, is to overlook the work of other artists and make sure it's correct, which is one of the other things that we're supposed to do. As we're kind of a bridge between the tech art team and the art team, so we have to kind of keep the balance between the two of them. And I'll get a little bit more technical in this when I open Designer and show you some of that stuff. But I do have to go through some of the Painter and Designer stuff first in the presentation and show you how we do that. So we're starting with Substance Painter, and one of the things I like to show is the meat maps that when we first place in the meat map 2 competition. There's a lot of layers into it, a lot of layerings of different materials, and I'll show you some of the ways I achieved that. So here it was kind of for the horns, it was using the displacement artifacts as an effect. And the way I've done that is to paint with a brush that has a pretty big fall off to get the shape right, and then kind of extend those colors with the displacement. So that's one of the effects I managed to achieve inside of Painter here. And the other thing was creating alphas inside of Designer and creating some materials inside of Designer to get something working right. So here on the top, you see a few different noises combined together will get us that kind of effect you have on the pants there. So that's one example of how I combined layers in Painter to get that effect. And on the bottom, you can see the different alphas and how those alphas are then applied to the height map and the normal map and how everything works together. Moving on, here's a 3D print from it, which is good. You can displace your mesh, and it's perfectly good for 3D printing. There was this company called Mimaki, which are doing incredible 3D prints for everything related to Adobe. So if you haven't checked those out, check them out. They're pretty cool. We're moving on to Software Designer, which is the most interesting thing and probably why most people are here today. And we're starting with reference images. Gathering reference is really important, where we have to get everything correct, and that means you have to get big mood boards, and those mood boards will determine how everything works in there. And then you have to decide which elements to tackle first and which last, and what has to be, as you see in this image, the macro shapes, the mid-level shapes, the mid to micro shapes, and only the micro shapes. Only the micro shapes, you can put them in normal maps with the normal combined nodes and the normal blends. You don't need everything to be in your height map to make it noisy, and that's going to result in a displacement that's a bit spiky, I would say, for lack of a better word. You only need the displacement to have your macro shapes in, and everything else will be handled by the normal map. That's why we have both of them working. So establishing those shapes before you start doing anything, I think, is the most important thing, and then you can kind of try to replicate it inside of Designer. And here I have it step by step how I try to make it use the different nodes to create the different shapes. So, for example, we start with the macro shape that we identified from the last image, and you see how we can create this very simple shape that we're gonna layer everything on or around it while we try to do stuff like that. So here we start making the different shapes, and we start overlaying them on top. Those are the mid shapes, and those are going to go into the height map, but anything after the mid shapes is probably left to the normal. And here is some of the other shapes that are going to be in the height map, but we want to work them so the height map is not that noisy. So here you can see how we add those to the texture itself. And here is some clever examples of how you can use different nodes to create different ornaments. So for example, we can make a very simple shape noise and then use the swirl grayscale and bevel it. And after we bevel it, we can use a height extrude, and you're gonna get those very interesting patterns. I think the swirl grayscale is one of my favorite nodes. You can do so much interesting things with it. And so I use it almost in every graph I have. So don't underestimate that node. It's very powerful. And here you can see how I can create a leaf shape. I splatter circle it, and the swirl grayscale gives me this ornament, which is very simple to achieve, but very effective. And here you can see how we can make even more ornaments using the swirl grayscale. It's the same thing. You walk and you walk, and you end up with this. And then you start having your roughness and metallic maps. You decide which one is going to be metallic. Obviously, we have gold here. We have some wooden, painted wood. We want those to be different surfaces. And then we can kind of start getting our colors right. So there's a very good tool called Adobe Color, which is a color wheel that allows you to get complementary colors. So don't only get colors from your reference, try to get the complementary colors that work together. So here we get the complementary colors that are on the reference image and that work together with which are going to be only on the painted wood. And then we get the second colors, which is the gold, on top of it. And that's how we achieve this result. And this is the end result, which combines all of these effects together. And I think that was the end of the presentation. Now I can show you a bit more about the stuff I was starting to tell you about in Substance Designer and some of the things I tried making I've put on my portfolio that I can show you. And give me 1 second. So,
Niki, can I have a quick question actually whilst you're getting ready for the next bit? You mentioned trim sheets textile density a couple of times.
Yeah.
I think pretty much I've always told students that their portfolio should be rendered to the highest level so they can show off all the details. But are you saying that they should also have sort of further down examples that they've understood trim sheets and they've built it for a specific game?
So I would say don't try to be very specific with the textile density when you're doing a portfolio piece, because the portfolio piece is obviously not going to be optimized to be an actual game, and you want to actually show how the best of what you can do. But it is important to show that you can understand textile density, and even at the highest quality possible, the textile density can be very important. Because let's say you're making this environment piece and you have like these big buildings that are using 4K maps, because you're not going to go more than 4K. And you're blending a few bricks and a few other textures, some plaster, let's say, with the 4K maps, and that all looks very good. But then next to that, let's say you have a small table that has like some mugs and some kitchen utensils, stuff like that, very small props. And if those props are using 4K maps, they're not gonna be in the same textile density, and they're gonna be looking a lot sharper than everything else around them, which is kind of gonna break the consistency of the scene. So while it's good to try to get the highest possible quality, you don't want to have this difference between the surfaces. So I've often seen, let's say, some, as I said, mugs and plates and stuff on someone's portfolio that look very sharp, but the wood on the table underneath is a bit blurry because of the textile density. Because you're not going to be able to go more than 4K for your portfolio piece, because if your mugs are 4K, that means that everything else should be 16K or 32K, which is ridiculous. So try to keep it that, and that's gonna give better results, in my opinion, at least. And the stuff I was trying to show you with this material here is I'm trying to, as I said, incorporate some breakdowns. And here I've made like a sticker generator inside of Painter that let me overlay those inside of Designer later. But I wouldn't be able to handcraft these sticker effects in Designer and have them be so unique if I only do them there. So I made this filter in Designer, and then I made a few different layers in Painter that allow me to make this edge damage, which is then derived with anchor points by everything I draw by hand. So I draw this damage by hand, and then everything I've drawn is then procedurally damaged on top of it, which combines hand-painted stuff with procedural stuff, which is the best way to approach something, because it's going to be looking unique, but it's also going to be fast. And here is an example in Houdini where I made the cobwebs. I just followed a few different tutorials and made my own generator, which I then put on an atlas, I baked down, and I added to my Custom Designer graph. And that's how I got the result to kind of show these interesting cobwebs here. While if I was trying to make them procedural in Designer, they wouldn't look that three-dimensional. They'd be quite flat because it's a bit difficult to achieve cobwebs in Designer. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are going to have GIFs like this that show them the process step by step. And if you slow this down, you're going to learn exactly how I make things. And a lot of people do that. And it's a very, very good way of learning how to layer your height maps. Because in the end of the day, learning how to layer your height map is the only way you're going to make good materials in Designer. So yeah, here's a few examples of that. And the other thing I was going to be showing was this shader we made in F1 Manager, where all of these one second, yeah. So all of these tiles are damaged over time based on those masks, and you can see how those are blended together, and that's all driven by different gameplay elements, and the result is pretty cool in game actually. So it's a lot of clever stuff like that we can do with materials, and then with shaders, of course. But we're blending both of these textures, and we're achieving results like that in the end. And if you want to have a closer look at some of the paints we had in deliveries and how metallic they are and how they reflect light, and we also had like a separate carbon fiber that we did with masks, and in the shader we tile a specific carbon fiber texture that has a specific properties applied to it, because making an actual carbon fiber texture is requires some shader effects to go on. And here are some examples of how they look in game. And now I think we can go inside of Designer and maybe show you some more interesting things.
Just
So
to tack on to
here-
the end of the question that that Mike mentioned earlier on about sort of levels of textile density versus resolution.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask, when you're doing sort of the real sort of micro details, as you sort of condense them into sort of 4 categories earlier on within Designer, when you're having to deal with the resolution that is more optimized, what kind of fail safes can you put in so that, or from your experience, what have you been able to do to manage lower resolution with those micro details to make sure that they're not coming through pixelated within some of your graphs?
So the way we do it at work, at least, is we always work at 4K, and we try to transfer most of the information in 32 bits inside of the graph in Designer, and we have a parameter that switches the end of the graph to 1K. So you're working in 4K, but you're exporting at 1K or lower. That will ensure that all the details are gonna get compressed right, instead of working at a lower resolution, which you won't have the details to begin with for them to get compressed correctly.
Are you doing any bespoke sort of UV management with any of the assets that the smaller aspects of them in order to be able to make sure that they come through okay, or is it something that you manage on the texture on a texture level rather than?
I think the most important thing is to manage them on the texture level, and sometimes going outside of texture density can be okay. We try to not go outside of more than 15 to 20% outside of texture density, and that's pushing it. But some assets can actually benefit from that. So I think that's a way that we can kind of get around that. And obviously, some of the times it's the way textures get compressed inside of games. So most textures are going to use a BC3 compression, which is pretty bad at handling grayscale values near the left end of the histogram. So that would mean that everything that's, if your material is almost gray and you have different gray values in there, they're going to get these compression artifacts and pixelated effects, So the only two ways to do that is to actually change your compressions to use a better type of compression like a BC7, but the BC7 is going to double the size of your texture, so you have to be mindful with that. Or the other way is to try to remove most of those grayscale values inside of your texture. So those are things that you should manage in texture level rather than after that. So we try to manage things before, so we have less things to fix later on, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. That sort of leads on to another question we've got from a viewer here, from D Arcadius. The question is, how much did you have to remove from all the texture work in Substance to fit into Unreal? Was there any issues with the feature parity?
So what do you mean from remove? So remove the grayscale values here, or can we give a use case for this one?
So I'm thinking within this, maybe they're in sort of reference to the smaller details, and their previous comment was alluding to sort of the tile wear. Is there any sort of management there that you had to go through?
So we don't really remove that much details. I think the only textures that actually make issues is the one that they have very fine noise, and that fine noise is squares, so they look like pixels, and that one is not gonna compress very good inside of Unreal or inside of any other engine.
So there's an extension of that comment, which was, I just know the limits of Unreal, so I wondered about, let's say, tessellation.
So with tessellation, you just have to have your texture, for example, either slightly blurred. I like to use a anistrophic blur at the end of my graph set to something very low, like 0.03, for example. And I try to remove very fine noise. For example, let me try to give a good example. So let's say we're making some wooden planks. I'm not gonna put any of the wood grain inside of my height map. I'm only gonna add it to the normal map, and the wood planks are only going to be fairly simple black and white planks instead of having all the small grain and small details and cracks inside of it, which will result in a lot smoother displacement. Because when you have those small details in there, the displacement actually searches for geometry to displace that, and when it doesn't have that geometry to displace it correctly, you're gonna have these weird displacement artifacts. And the more simple your height map is, the better displacement you're gonna have. Which also brings me to another thing we kind of did on Formula One Manager with the displacements and height maps and stuff. So when we were making the landscape textures, Unreal has this limitation that you can only have 16 texture samples per landscape component. So if your landscape consists of like 16 components, you can only have 16 texture samples on each component. You can have more samples in the shader, but if you paint those samples down in Unreal, you're gonna have they either gonna display right in Unreal, or the other thing that can happen is they're gonna display correctly in Unreal, but on PS5 they're gonna load up as pink. On Xbox 360 the landscape is not gonna render at all. So not 360, Xbox One, they're not gonna render correctly. So you're gonna have to manage those samples, and 4 of those 16 samples are used for rendering, so you're left with 12 samples. So what we did is we decided that we can use 2 samples per landscape material. So we haven't used displacement in the shader, but we use landscape blending. So that meant that we can put the height map in the blue channel of the normal map, which means that we can kind of get away with that and put the roughness map in the alpha channel of the base core. So the roughness map, we don't really care if it's 8 bits or 16 bits. We're still going to get pretty accurate representation of the grayscale values. But for the height map, it was a bit more tricky because if you ever had a height map of 8 bits in Designer, you would notice weird artifacts that you can get with quantization and stuff like that. But when you're needing the height map only to blend between materials, you don't really need that much of a that much bit depth. So we decided to put it in the normal map because the normal map uses a lot better compression than any other texture map. And the blue channel of the normal map is just a vector with the length of 1, always showing at the target space, which we can calculate in Engine because it's just one vector that we can add to the blue channel. And we can then use the blue channel for the height map, and that height map is gonna work exactly as we want to blend between textures, because some of the textures do require some more sophisticated height maps for blending. So that's some stuff we managed to do inside of Unreal, but manage those inside of Designer first. And the other thing, Unreal is really weird with color spaces. So if you export anything from Designer at 16 bits, it expects it to be in linear space, which means if your texture is in sRGB space and you export it at 16 bits, Unreal is automatically going to apply a sRGB curve on top, which gonna have 2 curves in that case, and your texture is gonna be blown out. So the way to get around that and using 16 bits is to export in linear space, and when you import it in Unreal is gonna apply the curve on import, which is gonna give you the correct result. And sometimes you do need those 16 bits if the compression is too bad or some other more specific use cases. So hopefully that answers most of your questions about that. And I can show you what I have prepared here. So that's a very simple setup here. Basically, it's a pixel processor with just a few nodes. We want to convert our texture from RGB to HSV, which is going to give us, and then swizzle the Z, which is going to give us the value. So basically that gives us the value of that sample. So it samples the central part of the texture and then gives us the value. Then when we make a gradient map here, we can kind of get all of these different pins in the correct space that we want to. So we want this at 0.5, we want this at 0.8, and that's going to give us the gradient we have for the metallic map, for example. And here I've prepared a few small examples of some nodes that we can kind of explore the stuff I've been talking about so far. So the first thing is height layering. So if we get this, let me quickly get my distillation on. So if we blend these two shapes with a max value, this is basically cutting through to the shape below, and if we reduce the max size, it's basically giving you a half blend of these two. A really better way to do this is with a shape spotter node, and the shape spotter node allows you to get these really nice smooth transitions and a very nice control of them. So you can see how, depending on how much we put here, we can get these smooth transitions for anything we want to lay on top of each other, which is super powerful and super good to layer multiple objects on top of each other. Like I have some graphs that I have to layer, let's say 30 or 40 different layers on top of each other, and all the time I'm going to use shape spotter. And the other thing that's very powerful is, if you can give me 1 second, if we can use the histogram range, because the different thing that is gonna do outside of what the level does is that the histogram range kind of preserves the whole range, but it compresses it. And when you auto level it in the end, it's gonna get back to the full range. While if you do it manually with the levels node, for example, it's not gonna do that. So this is a very, very good technique. Another thing that I often see is incorrect ambient occlusions, and I see this very, very often. So a lot of people put their textures on ArtStation like a breakdown, and often I see very, very dark AOs. The AO should be almost completely white, and anything darker than that is going to be incorrect. For example, the only way to get it right is to use world units. You put the shape of your texture, so that's depending on the texture density you've previously established, and then you put how high this texture is going to be. So obviously, if your texture is going to be, let's say, some planks, you're going to have like maybe 2 centimeters, and that's going to be your AO. It's not going to be this. And the issue with AO is that it reacts to light a bit differently. So if you have some AO textures that have completely black points in them, that means that anytime they're going to be in the shade in the engine, they're going to render completely black, and they're not going to receive any lighting at all. So that's one use case that you can get wrong results, but that can also be a pretty good effect. So I'm gonna just drag this quickly here. So one of the trim sheets I did on Warhammer Age of Sigmar Realms of Ruin was this anchor point hero asset for the Nightcoms. And we have these windows here, but we don't want to spend any geometry on them, and we want them to be hollow. So what we do here is we made the inside of the window completely blocking the AO, which is going to mean it's not going to receive any light, and it's going to look completely dark, and it's going to get this depth back to you without spending any resources on geometry. The whole, I think the whole asset is, let me show you down here. It's this thing, and it's just a cylinder with some extrusions, and everything else is just the trim sheet. So the AO trick can be very powerful, but use it with intention, and otherwise be sure that your values are correct. That's I think something that's very important. One other trick that I really like to do is the metal edge wear node. And a lot of people overlook this because they think they can only use it on metal. I use it on absolutely everything, and I'll show you the use case. I discovered this trick while I was working on Formula One, and it's pretty powerful. So let's say we have this this plank, and we've kind of made ourselves the damage, and we want to highlight these edges. Then in that case, we're gonna be we're gonna put it to a curvature smooth and an ambient occlusion, get it to the metal edge wear, and once we blend it on top, you're gonna have these highlights on your edges. They're gonna look a lot sharper, and even with lower resolutions, they're still gonna hold up pretty sharp. So that's one thing I can do. And the other thing that it's important with trim sheets is you have to remember that when you're making trim sheets, you cannot really cut away from the mesh like with cutaway here, because when you put that on the mesh, you won't have anything underneath. So it's gonna render any color that's underneath it, or it's gonna be black depending on how you've done your trim sheet. So let's say we just have this straight piece in here, but we use the slope blur without it ever being part of the same thing. It's only gonna go to the metal edge wear. That means that when we get this edge damage here, we're gonna have still the edge underneath from what we had before, but we're gonna have something damaged outside of it, which is gonna allow us to have information below here, and it's not gonna look weird when we map it to any object. So keep in mind that when you're making trim sheets. The next example here is I'm going to show you how to make a semi-working flow map, because this is not the correct way of making a flow map, but it's the quickest way of achieving the result. So let's say we make a shape, and I'm going to use a swirl node to kind of make it more interesting. When we use a normal map, and then we can use an RGBA split, and we can blend together the RNB channel, the RNG channel, but leave the blue channel out. And that's going to leave us with something that has a flow map property to it. It's not correctly using the blue channel. It doesn't account for the blue channel, but for making textures like this, it's perfectly fine. We can then use a mask from our shape, and we can then blend this into the vector map input and the mask input. And that's going to give us like this, these shapes that are following the direction of the flow map, which in turns is going to give us something like some sort of stitching. And you can see here, when we kind of change this, it's always going to follow the pattern, which is a very good way to get some sort of effect like this without ever relying on, let's say, the spline nodes. And I'm going to give another example with stuff we did in Warhammer. And one of the materials here is this hammer. And that's the same way I did this kind of stitching effect. And let's scroll down here, and we have like a example of how that was achieved with the height maps. So you see, we make all the shapes, and then we're going to use some flow maps to drive those shapes to have that stitching. And I layer multiple amounts of stitching, so it's more convincing. And in the end, you get this effect, which is like quite convincing, at least in game. And getting back to Designer, I'm gonna show you a few more tricks. And for example, if you're using any shape and you use an edge detector net, so you can use a flood fill. We can use flood fill to random color. We can then use a distance node to remove this. And if we plug the vector color into the vector world grayscale or vector morph, we can kind of randomize where we want this effect to appear. So anything we plug on top is gonna appear in a random place based on the colors of the flood fill random. And this can be this can also be done with a flow map, and it's gonna try to distort it the same way we're kind of doing here, because this is essentially the same thing with the vector map input. But it's some pretty powerful stuff. So for example, here, if we do this, we multiply it, we can get this effect only applied where we kind of want it to. So I think that's a very good approach to do things. And the other thing I want to show you is let's do some planks, for example, and I'll show you how I tackle edge damage on those and how you can do some really convincing things with them. So I usually start with a tile sampler, and I go to a color random here, and I edge detect that. And when I edge detect it, I can then use a small bevel, and then we can start working on the damage itself. I always use a curve node after that, so I can control the profile of the curve. And after that, I can start with, let's say, the small brush. And what I do with the small brush is something quite interesting. So for example, I'm gonna make it like normal, And then I start making non-uniform noises for the snowboard, which gives us very directional and very interesting effects. And we kind of trying to guesswork what we want to achieve here, but just bear with me. I promise it's something that's gonna be really good. So the only issue here is that we want to be working with very, very small values. So something like this. We already have a lot more convincing results. You can then do auto noises, which are gonna give us similar results. And I always try to incorporate this. You can see how I can kind of control this effect. And if I don't want this effect to be almost everywhere, I can kind of get another noise, and I can use a levels mode here to bump between those values, and that's gonna let me use only part of the noise, so not everywhere. So you see how I can control the effects to not be absolutely everywhere, which gives us a lot of freedom to work. And then we can do even more. Crystal noises are nice because they're very sharp, very you can do a lot of breaks with them. Like you can break a lot of the bricks in a sorry, not the bricks, the planks in a more natural way. And what I'm gonna do here is the same thing. I don't want the whole thing to be actively breaking. So right now we have this. And the other thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to be snowboarding this again with another quotes, which is gonna be, we're not gonna touch it, and I'll show you why in just 1 second. But yeah, let me just show you what this already looks like in the 3D view. And I do want to remove my tessellation because it's better to work without tessellation, if I have to be completely honest. I only turn it on to check a few different things, but because most of the time you're not going to use tessellation, it's actually a lot better to actually not use that much of it. So here, what I'm trying to achieve is I want to blend two different kind of effects, but with different values. And you can see how we can add it with a very, very low opacity and reduce my AL, and we get more convincing damage. And I can even reduce this a bit more. Not this one, I guess the second one, which is gonna give us more convincing results. And that already gives us a very, very good start to actually get a pretty nice result here. What I'm gonna also try to do is, let's say, so from here on, we already have this edge damage. We want to get some directional noise flowing. So there's a couple of ways to do it. I do really like to experiment. Just try a bunch of notes. Don't try to learn everything by heart. I obviously know stuff that works and stuff that doesn't really work that well, but I do also try to experiment for the most part with a lot of noises. So here, let's say I work this out a little bit, and let's see what this is gonna give us. So trying to get a nice directionality. something like this maybe. And if I blend it on top, we're gonna have some convincing, well, maybe not that convincing just yet, but if we play a little bit more with this, we're gonna have some convincing results. The one thing when you're trying to do stuff with planks is you don't want any information to go from one plank to the other one, which is because each plank is being cut in a different place. So we want to kind of randomize this. So to randomize it, we can do a vector warp grayscale, one of things, and we can do the stuff I already showed you with the flood fill to random color. I can do a flood fill here, and I can just randomly plug this into, let's say, this. Ooh, so here we've kind of encountered one problem. So, and that's a good thing because I can show you how you can get around it. When you have planks that are going from one side to the other without any continuous break, that's gonna make the flood fill not work. So there are two hacky ways to do it. One hacky way is obviously you're not gonna always have this like this. You're gonna have some planks that are kind of breaking. So you're gonna have the end of the plank, and that's gonna get you a nice flood fill. But let's say we don't want this right now. Let's say it's still at 1. So when it's still at 1, a hacky way, but a good way would be to use a transform node, remove the tiling horizontally, and kind of get this a little bit shorter. This is gonna give you a more accurate result that you can then kind of, when you get the flood fill to random color, and then you can kind of squeeze it back in. It's a hacky thing, but when you're in a hurry and you don't want to deal with the flood fill not working, it's perfectly valid way of achieving that result. And now this is going
amazing.
to be.
I know it's hacky, but that's amazing because I've been playing around with stuff like that in the past, and I have no idea how you did it. But that's so cool. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples, and one of the reasons why I didn't prepare a whole graph to show you in the beginning is that I wanted to create something from scratch, and you can kind of see my thought process and what I do when I encounter any problems. And now that we have these different ones, you see how they shifted between planks. This is exactly what I wanted because they're not going to have this continuous pattern. And it's a small thing, but it does make a huge difference in here. And let's, for example, continue here and just try a few different things and show you. So here, for example, we can kind of use the edge detect to try some interesting things. The multi-directional warp, actually the non-uniform multi-directional warp is a very, very fun node to use. So let me try a few things. See how we can kind of warp this a few different ways. And we can kind of swap work this again. And you can already use either some of our existing noises, which are going to give us something cool like this, or it's all about trying stuff, especially when you're not working from any reference like I'm doing right now, which you should always work with reference. Don't take just this particular advice from me, but for the sake of explaining things, I'm gonna commit this simple. But if we get stuff like this, and that's gonna give us even more things to work with in terms of something that's damaged, if you can see. Or the other way, the other thing we can do is we can also use a non-uniform work grayscale to kind of make this a little bit softer. And this is gonna give us a more uniform way of doing things. That's me. And from here, we can kind of just see some of the stuff I want to try. Yeah, okay. From here, we can kind of start looking at some cracks in the wood. So let's say we can do a paraboloid, and we can get this paraboloid to kind of get some different effects in it. I want to usually warp it a bit, and I want to do something like this. And I want to warp it based on a noise, and I want to use a tile sample for this one. And this one is going to give us a let's say something like this. We can then kind of randomize this and get this to a lower pattern, to a tiny shape like this. And I want to do the same thing here, but instead of a tiny shape, I want a really, really long one. So let's say, wrong one. So let's say something like this, but and then kind of it's all about playing with all kind of different patterns like this. And with the flood filter randomly, we can also reuse this. We can reuse this flood fill again with the flood fill to random grayscale, and with the we can reuse this node to get this effect again. And then again here we can kind of use a directional warp. We can warp it based on those. And the other warp thing I wanna try is we can use a directional sketches. We can rotate these, we can use the scale. We can do a quantize to grayscale to get a more interesting effect. It's actually a good idea to add to this thing later. It's always trying to reuse as much as you can, and that allows you to do materials really quickly. And for example, here you can see how we reduce the scale, we can get maybe not that much of an effect, but let's say if we do this and we kind of get a luminance by random, and we kind of want this to be the different scales and different lumen values, that's going to give us a little breakage in the shapes or something like this. And then we'll work this again. And we can reuse any of the noises, or we can make new noises. It really doesn't matter, which would give us some kind of a result like this. And now I can kind of get extract this from our main shapes.
So you're going to be a massive inspiration to a lot of people, Niki. Who's yours?
Well, I do have a lot of material artists that I've looked up to, and fortunately I've had the opportunity to work with some of them or to get to know them. But everyone I've looked up to when I was learning designer, and people I've done tutorials from, people that actually helped me achieve what I want. Those are the people that give me inspiration to continue. And it's most of the material artists that's more present in the communities, and some of the material artists that have been nominated with awards with Adobe, let's say Jonathan Daniels, Eric Wiley. Those are phenomenal artists. Enrico Tamerkant, for example. I hope I'm not butchering the names, to be honest. And all kinds of other, even like as you said, Joe Taylor. Like he was, I was looking up to his materials when I was learning designer. I've been using designer for like maybe 4 years now, so it's not that I've been using it for that long as the other guys. So I think it's important to recognize the people that you've looked up, or the people that helped you achieve that. And I'm gonna take a few more notes and I'm gonna code it down, but I'm gonna show you exactly what I like to do with my material process here. So this is one I really like. I think it produces very nice shapes. You use a gradient linear with a paraboloid shape, and that gives you this very interesting kind of gradient type of shape, I would say. And when you do a shape plotter to this, you kind of randomize the shape, scale random, position random, offset, rotation random, mask random, color random, and then I use a work node and I use a Gaussian noise to work it. And that gives me some interesting shapes. And then I use this to subtract it. And you get these more, I would say, interesting shapes when you want to have some holes in your material. So obviously this is a very quick example, and you can definitely make it better, but let's not waste time here. And I want to add this to our second grain right now. So just a small copy of it. And that's going to give us a more natural feel. And here in the end, you can just copy this example I showed you before with the metal edgeware. And that highlights all of the edges you have. So you can kind of add them, but because everything is completely white at the moment, I need this to get a little bit lower in the histogram, and then I can add this, which is gonna highlight these edges a little bit more, which is gonna give us a lot more sharper edges based on the slope burst we used in the beginning. And one of the last things I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get this ambient occlusion. I'm gonna get a dust node, and that dust node is gonna highlight these edges a little bit more, so we can multiply them on top, subtract them, sorry, and that's gonna give us a little bit more definition and what we're trying to achieve. I'm also wanting to get this flat fill to random grayscale multiplied here. And one of the things that needs to happen is I need to use a distance node on it, just because it's not gonna multiply the shape correctly. So I always get these shapes the wrong way around. So we gotta do this. And now when I multiply this, I'm gonna have some variation here in terms of height. And at the end, one last note I can add is, I think it's called the edge speckle or edge notch. I'm not entirely sure which one was it. Maybe it's the edge speckle. Also, just to note, when using any of these edge detect and edge speckle and any of the generators, using it with curvature smooth and with curvature is gonna get you two completely different results. So just try things. Otherwise, it's not gonna work out for you. So both of these are a good thing to add. So these are kind of highlighting some stuff in the edge. So if we have like in paint and things, we can kind of add like a bubble sometimes to it, depending on which one we use, and that's gonna give us usually a nice effect in the end. And yeah, here you can see how we can fairly quickly create a wooden plank effects, and you can see how we made the damages, and then the edgeware highlights all of the damages. So it's a very cool effect, and it's sharp. And now when we export anything in here, we use the 4K, and we go up here to make it 1K, and the moment we put it at 1K and we export it, it's still gonna have these sharp edges. Even if you don't have the resolution from a distance, it's still going to be super sharp. So that's I think the correct way of getting these effects, and then downscaling. So I'm gonna code this little exercise complete, and I'll be happy to hear if you have any questions for this or for anything else.
You're a rock star, honestly. It just the speed of it is impressive, and the thought that goes into all of this as well, at such a quick speed, just is a testament to the experience that you've got, Niki, and obviously the time spent is what's enabled you to achieve that, and it's something that we're trying to get across to students at Staffordshire is that you've got to be in these programs more so than just in the for the assessments. You've got to want to almost become used to being in there more than you are not in there to get the benefit of the results that you want.
One of the things I like to tell students is that if you want to be successful, you have to be obsessed with it. Like, the game industry can be a very punishing industry in terms of if you want to get in, and with all the layoffs now and everything that's happening, you do have to really be obsessed and think about it all the time. And especially game development, it's more technical than that if you're not a concept artist, or let's say if you're not a character artist, although it's also still technical, but you still need to do a lot of stuff by hand, like sculpting and things like that. But anything else is very technical, and the only way to get good about it is to work with that software nonstop. Even if the results are not good, just stay consistent in there. I'm going to give you a small example. As I said, I studied something completely different. So I had to study like electrical engineering and coding and chemistry and physics. And on top of that, I have to go home and work on my portfolio and work on the jobs that I had for experience. So it was very draining, and I wouldn't recommend it to people that don't really want it. I've known that I want this for, I don't know, the last 10 to 15 years, and I was consistent in my desire to achieve it. And the only way to get good at the more technical stuff is just to spend time with the software.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. I don't see any more questions in the comments. I think we could possibly be talking about that substance graph for the entirety of the night, but I don't want to take up any more of your time, Niki. Obviously, it's precious for practicing or for doing what the projects that you're currently a part of. So again, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can remain talking to each other, because we're probably going to call upon you again at some point.
Please do, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I really do hope I was of use to any of your students. And I wish
I
to
think
see
you were used to us, let alone students.
Yeah, absolutely, mate, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I know the students are going to get used to this. Even the ones who didn't come to the stream, we've recorded this stream, so I know they're going to want to watch it back. And I imagine they're probably going to ask me, can you contact him and ask him for that graph so that we can have a closer look at it? So if that is an option, let me know.
Yeah, it's an option. I do have a lot of graphs that I try to show to students, and this is like a very quick example, but I've been used to doing quick stuff this quickly, and mainly using the power of designer is to reuse stuff from all graphs. I think that's the main thing. Like last week, I managed to do like 10 different materials at work just because I reworked I reused a bunch of stuff that I already made before. So I think that's the main thing. And the other thing I want to add before we close this down is, if any of the students do want any portfolio reviews, I would be happy to do so. Just shoot me a message, or tell your lecturers that they can contact me, and we can arrange that as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening for Fuse Games Conference. Hope you've been enjoying it so far. We certainly have. We hope that you're going to join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m. For our third day of industry guest talks. Our first is at 10 a.m. and Alex Beddoes, expert environment artist at That's No Moon. So hopefully you'll join us then. Thanks very much for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.